I knew something was wrong the moment I saw the moving truck backing up to my barn at 7 in the morning on a Saturday in March. I lived on a 15-acre property just outside Columbus, Ohio, in a development called Meadowbrook Estates that had somehow managed to slap an HOA onto properties this size. My name is Walter Thompson, and I had bought this land specifically because I wanted space, privacy, and a barn to restore my vintage motorcycles in peace. The HOA mainly handled the main entrance landscaping and street maintenance, or so I thought. I walked out of my farmhouse-style home in jeans and a flannel shirt, coffee mug in hand, watching as two men in work clothes started unloading furniture from the truck. Behind them stood Patricia Whitmore, the HOA president, a woman in her late 40s with that distinctive haircut that screamed she wanted to speak to the manager of life itself. She wore yoga pants and a designer jacket, clipboard in hand like it was a weapon. "Morning, Patricia," I called out, my voice carrying across the gravel driveway. "Mind telling me what's going on here?" She turned to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Good morning, Walter. The HOA is just using your barn for temporary storage. We're having the community center renovated, and we need somewhere to keep the furniture for a few weeks." I stopped walking, my coffee halfway to my lips. "You need to what now?" "Store furniture in your barn. It's empty anyway, isn't it?" She said this like it was the most reasonable thing in the world, her voice taking on that condescending tone that made my jaw clench. "Patricia, you can't just use my property without asking. This is private land." She waved her hand dismissively, and I noticed her acrylic nails were painted a bright coral. "The HOA bylaws state that in emergencies, the association can utilize available resources within the community. Your barn qualifies as an available resource." I walked closer, setting my coffee mug on the hood of my truck. "That's not what that clause means, and you know it. That's for natural disasters or community emergencies. You're renovating the community center by choice. The community center ceiling was damaged by water. That makes it an emergency." Her smile widened, and I could see she thought she had me cornered with that logic. The moving truck workers were already halfway to my barn with a leather couch. I stepped in front of them, holding up my hand. "Stop right there. Don't put anything in that barn." Patricia's expression hardened. "Walter, don't be difficult. This is for the good of the community. Unless you want to be fined for non-cooperation with HOA initiatives, I suggest you let us proceed." "Fine me then. You're not storing anything in my barn without my permission and without a contract that includes compensation." She laughed, actually laughed like I'd told a joke. "Compensation? We're the HOA. We don't pay residents to use their resources. That's not how this works." "Then that's not how my barn works," I said flatly. "Turn that truck around." The standoff lasted another 10 minutes. Patricia quoted increasingly creative interpretations of the HOA bylaws, which I knew she was making up on the spot because I had read them cover to cover before buying the property. The truck workers stood there awkwardly, the couch getting heavier in their arms by the second. Finally, Patricia's face flushed red with frustration. "Fine. But you'll be hearing from the HOA board about this. We will assess fines for your lack of community spirit." She turned on her heel and marched back to her white Mercedes SUV parked near the entrance to my property. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. 2 days later, on Monday afternoon, I got home from my job as an architectural engineer to find my barn door open. Not just unlocked, but wide open, and inside was furniture. Lots of furniture. Couches, tables, chairs, filing cabinets, even a broken water cooler. The entire community center's worth of contents appeared to be crammed into my barn, pushed up against my workbenches, my tool chests, and worst of all, my 2 vintage motorcycles that I had been restoring for 3 years. My blood pressure skyrocketed. I pulled out my phone and called Patricia immediately. "Meadowbrook HOA, Patricia speaking," she answered in that saccharine voice. "You broke into my barn," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "I don't know what you're talking about, Walter." "The furniture in my barn that I explicitly told you not to put there." "Oh, that. Well, the HOA board met and we voted. 3-1 in favor of utilizing your barn. Democracy in action." I could hear the smugness dripping from her words. "You can't vote to trespass on my property and break into my building." "We didn't break in. We used our master key." That stopped me cold. What master key? Every property in Meadowbrook Estates has an HOA master key on file. It's in the bylaws you signed, for emergencies. She paused. This is an emergency. I was gripping my phone so hard I thought the screen might crack. Get your furniture out of my barn by tomorrow morning, or I'm calling the police. The police won't do anything. This is a civil HOA matter, and if you touch any of that furniture, you'll be liable for damages. It's HOA property now under protective storage. She hung up. I stood there in my barn, surrounded by someone else's furniture, looking at my motorcycles barely visible behind a stack of folding chairs. A 1973 Triumph Bonneville and a 1969 Honda CB750, both in pieces, both worth thousands of dollars, and both now vulnerable to whatever the HOA decided to pile around them. That night, I didn't sleep. I spent hours researching Ohio property law, HOA regulations, and tenant storage rights. By 3 a.m, I had a plan. It wasn't a nice plan, but it was legal. The next morning, I took the day off work and drove to the county clerk's office in downtown Columbus. I filed a formal complaint about the trespassing and submitted a notice of bailment, which basically meant that since someone had left property on my land without permission, I was now the legal bailee of that property. Ohio law was very clear. If someone abandons property on your land or leaves it without a rental agreement, you can claim storage fees and eventually sell the property to recover those fees if the owner refuses to pay. I calculated my storage fee at $50 per square foot per month. The furniture took up about 400 square feet of my barn. That was $20,000 per month, prorated daily. I had the notice served to Patricia and the HOA board by a process server that same afternoon. Patricia called me 17 times in 2 hours. I didn't answer. Instead, I sent her a certified letter outlining my terms. Remove the furniture within 72 hours, or the storage fees would begin accruing. If the fees weren't paid within 30 days, I would auction the furniture to recover my costs, as was my legal right under Ohio Revised Code Section 1311. The 72 hours passed. The furniture stayed. Patricia sent me a letter from the HOA lawyer threatening legal action if I touched their property. I sent back a copy of the bailment law and my calculated fees, now at approximately $2,000 for 3 days. The HOA board called an emergency meeting. I wasn't invited, but my neighbor, George, who served on the board and was the one dissenting vote against using my barn, filled me in. Patricia had convinced the other 2 board members, Susan and Dale, that I was bluffing and that no court would side with me over the HOA. They voted to leave the furniture where it was and let me waste my money on legal fees. 30 days crawled by. Every day I documented the furniture in my barn with photographs and videos, noting any damage, any shifts in the stacks, any evidence that the items were being stored improperly by their own neglect. My motorcycles gathered dust. My restoration work ground to a halt. I received 3 separate fines from the HOA, one for unsightly property maintenance because I had stopped mowing the decorative strip of grass near the road in protest, one for unauthorized barn usage, which was rich considering they were the ones using it without authorization, and one for disturbing community harmony. I didn't pay any of the fines. I added them to my counterclaim. On day 31, I filed for the legal right to auction the abandoned property. The court date was set for 3 weeks out, in early May. Patricia showed up with the HOA lawyer, a tired-looking man in his 60s named Robert Chen, who clearly wished he was working on something else. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Judge Sandra Martinez, listened to both sides. Patricia argued that the HOA had the right to use community resources, that I was being petty and vindictive, and that the furniture was needed for the community center, which was essential infrastructure. I presented my documentation, the photographs from the day I told them not to use my barn, the evidence that they had broken in anyway, the lack of any rental agreement or compensation, the bailment notice, and the certified letters that went unanswered. I also presented evidence that the community center renovation was purely cosmetic, not emergency repairs, based on the contractor's public business license filing, which described the work as interior aesthetic updates. Judge Martinez took about 5 minutes to decide. The HOA had no legal right to store property on Mr. Thompson's land without his permission or without compensation. The emergency clause in the HOA bylaws clearly refers to natural disasters or immediate threats to safety, not elective renovations. Mr. Thompson followed proper legal procedure for abandoned property. He is within his rights to auction the furniture to recover storage fees. Patricia's face went purple. Your Honor, this is ridiculous. That furniture is worth maybe $8,000 total. He's claiming $20,000 in fees. Then the HOA should have removed it when Mr. Thompson asked, Judge Martinez said dryly, or negotiated a reasonable storage fee. You chose to do neither. Judgment for the plaintiff. Mr. Thompson may proceed with the auction. I scheduled the auction for the following Saturday at 10 in the morning, right in my barn where the furniture sat. I hired a licensed auctioneer, an energetic man in his 50s named Chuck, who ran estate sales around Columbus. I advertised the auction online in the local newspaper and on community bulletin boards. The ad was simple. HOA Furniture Auction Community Center Contents, Saturday, 10 a.m., Meadowbrook Estates, Columbus, OH. The HOA sent me increasingly frantic letters. They offered to pay $1,000, then $2,000, then $5,000. I responded each time with the same message. The storage fees were now at 35 days and counting, totaling approximately $23,000. They could pay that amount, or the auction would proceed, and I would recover what I could. Friday night before the auction, someone tried to break into my barn. My security cameras, which I had installed after the HOA's first break-in, caught everything. It was Dale, one of the board members, a balding man in his early 50s who owned a car dealership. He tried to pick the new lock I had installed, failed, then tried to pry the door open with a crowbar. He managed to damage the door frame before my alarm went off and scared him away. I called the police. They arrived within 20 minutes, and I showed them the footage. Dale was arrested at his house an hour later and charged with attempted burglary and property damage. The police report noted that he admitted he was trying to retrieve HOA property, but claimed he had permission from Patricia. Saturday morning dawned clear and warm. By 9:30, there were already 15 people gathered outside my barn, including several of my neighbors who had grown tired of the HOA's overreach and wanted to support me. Patricia showed up at 9:45 in her Mercedes, but she stayed in the car, watching with fury etched on her face. Chuck the auctioneer was in his element. He had arranged the furniture into lots: living room furniture, office furniture, tables, chairs, miscellaneous items. At exactly 10, he started the auction. Good morning, folks. Welcome to today's auction of furniture and fixtures, legally authorized for sale to recover unpaid storage fees. All sales are final, cash or card. Items must be removed by end of day. Let's start with Lot 1, a 3-piece leather sofa set in good condition. Who'll give me $100? The bidding was brisk. My neighbors bid on items they actually wanted. Some antique dealers who had seen the ad bid on the nicer pieces. A used office furniture store owner bid on the filing cabinets and desks. Patricia stayed in her car. 2 hours later, the auction was done. Total proceeds, $18,400. Not quite enough to cover my claimed fees, but Chuck explained that was normal for forced auctions. The auctioneer's fee was 10%, leaving me with about $16,500. As people carted away their purchases, Patricia finally got out of her car. She walked up to me with tears of rage in her eyes, her coral nails pointing at me like little daggers. You're going to pay for this, Walter. I will make your life in this community a living hell. You'll never know peace. Fines every single week. Violations for every tiny thing. I will make you regret ever crossing the HOA. I looked at her calmly. You trespassed on my property, broke into my barn, stored your items without permission, refused to pay reasonable fees, and one of your board members committed a crime, trying to steal the items back. I'd say we're past the point of HOA fines, Patricia. Those items were worth more than what you got at auction. We'll sue you for the difference. The judge already ruled. You're welcome to appeal. But the ruling was pretty clear. A sheriff's deputy pulled up then, which surprised both of us. He got out and walked over, nodding at me. Mr. Thompson, I have something for you. He handed me a document. It was a restraining order against Patricia. George, my neighbor on the HOA board, had filed it on behalf of several residents, documenting Patricia's harassment, threats, and misuse of HOA authority. The order barred her from contacting me or coming onto my property for 6 months. Patricia's face went from red to white. "This is insane! I'm the HOA president!" "You're also harassing residents and were involved in a criminal trespass," the deputy said. "The restraining order is valid. You need to leave this property now, madam." She left, tires spitting gravel. The deputy stayed for a few more minutes to make sure she was gone, then left as well. By 4 that afternoon, my barn was empty except for my motorcycles and my tools. I spent the rest of the weekend cleaning, reorganizing, and finally getting back to work on the Triumph. It felt like my space again. Monday morning, I got a call from George. "Walter, you need to hear this. Emergency board meeting last night. Patricia has been removed as HOA president." "What happened?" "After Dale's arrest and the restraining order, Susan and I voted her out. The HOA's lawyer looked into everything she'd done, and it turns out she never had legal authority to use your barn. She forged 2 board approval signatures on the original authorization document. She also used HOA funds to pay for her personal legal defense. The lawyer says the HOA could be liable for criminal fraud charges." "Is it going to affect the neighborhood?" "The HOA might be dissolved entirely. Honestly, most people would be fine with that. We don't need an HOA for properties this size. The county handles the roads, everyone maintains their own property, and we can contract the entrance landscaping privately if we want. Patricia turned this HOA into her personal fiefdom, and people are done with it." Over the next few weeks, the dominoes continued to fall. Dale pleaded guilty to attempted burglary and got probation plus community service, along with paying for my barn door repairs. The HOA's insurance company investigated Patricia's misuse of funds and found she had spent over $15,000 of HOA money on personal expenses over 2 years, claiming they were administrative costs. The insurance company refused to cover any of the auction losses or legal fees, leaving Patricia personally liable. Patricia hired her own lawyer and tried to sue me for the value of the furniture. Her lawyer dropped the case after one look at Judge Martinez's ruling and the documentation I had. Without legal representation, Patricia's case went nowhere. In June, the HOA was officially dissolved by a vote of the residents. 78% voted to dissolve, tired of the fees, the overreach, and the drama. The remaining HOA funds were distributed among the homeowners as a rebate, about $400 each. The entrance landscaping was taken over by a neighborhood committee that contracted directly with a local landscaping company for a fraction of what the HOA had been paying. Patricia moved out of Meadowbrook Estates in July. I heard through the neighborhood gossip network that she and her husband were getting divorced, partially because of the financial liability she had created. She sold their house at a loss to get out quickly. As for me, I finished restoring the Triumph in August. It was a beautiful machine, all chrome and black leather, purring like a dream. I took it for a long ride through the Ohio countryside on a Saturday morning, the summer sun warm on my shoulders, the road empty and inviting. When I got back to my barn, I stood there for a moment looking at the space. My space. No unwanted furniture, no HOA breathing down my neck, no Patricia threatening me with fines for every tiny perceived violation. Just my tools, my projects, and my property. George stopped by later that afternoon with a 6-pack of local craft beer. We sat on my porch, looking out over the 15 acres that I had specifically bought to have freedom and peace. "You know, when you first stood up to Patricia that day with the moving truck, I thought you were crazy," George said, taking a sip of his beer. "I thought she'd bury you in legal fees and fines." "I thought about backing down," I admitted, "but then I realized that if I let her get away with it, she'd never stop. Not just with me, but with everyone in the neighborhood." "You were right. Half the neighborhood was terrified of her. She threatened to fine the Johnsons because their kid's basketball hoop was unsightly. She tried to make the Patel family remove their vegetable garden because it wasn't aesthetically consistent with the neighborhood. She even sent a violation notice to old Mrs. Henderson because her grass was a 1/4 inch too long, and the woman is 92 years old. I shook my head. How did she get so much power? People not paying attention. She ran for HOA president unopposed 3 years ago because nobody else wanted to deal with the headache. Then she slowly expanded her authority, making up rules, interpreting the bylaws in increasingly creative ways. By the time people realized what was happening, they felt powerless to stop her. Well, she's stopped now. George raised his beer. To property rights and standing up to bullies, I clinked my bottle against his. I'll drink to that. The sun set over my property, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. In the barn, the Honda CB750 waited for its turn at restoration. I had plans for it, careful plans that would take months of work, but now I had the time and the space to do it right. My phone buzzed. It was an email from the county clerk's office, confirming that the lien I had placed on Patricia's former property for the unpaid storage fees had been satisfied out of her house sale proceeds. I would be receiving a check for the remaining $7,000 she owed me within 30 days. I showed George the email. He whistled low. She's really paying the price for this. She made her choices. She could have removed the furniture when I first asked. She could have negotiated a reasonable fee. She could have accepted the judge's ruling and paid the storage costs. Instead, she escalated at every opportunity and dragged her board members into criminal activity. Dale's still bitter about the probation. Dale broke into my barn with a crowbar. He's lucky it was just probation. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fireflies start to emerge in the twilight. The neighborhood was quieter now without the HOA drama. People actually talked to each other again, helped each other with projects, borrowed tools and shared recipes. It felt like a real community instead of a dictatorship with a smile. The next morning, Sunday, I got an unexpected visitor. It was Susan, the other former HOA board member, a woman in her early 60s who taught at the local elementary school. She looked nervous. "Walter, do you have a minute?" "Sure, come on in. Want some coffee?" We sat at my kitchen table, and she wrapped her hands around the mug like she needed the warmth despite the summer heat outside. "I wanted to apologize," she said finally. "I voted to put the furniture in your barn. Patricia convinced me it was legal, that the HOA had the authority, that you were being unreasonable. I should have looked into it more carefully. I should have stood up to her like George did." I considered her words. Susan had always been quiet at HOA meetings, letting Patricia dominate the conversations. Why didn't you? Honestly, I was scared of her. She had this way of making you feel stupid if you questioned her. She would cite bylaws and regulations and make it sound like you were the problem if you didn't understand her logic. And she was relentless. If you crossed her, she'd find ways to make your life difficult. Little fines, little violations, constant pressure. That's not how an HOA is supposed to work. I know that now. After Dale was arrested and the lawyer investigated Patricia's finances, I realized how far off the rails everything had gone. I'm sorry I was part of it. I nodded slowly. I appreciate the apology, but you need to understand something, Susan. You weren't just part of it. You enabled it. Every time you voted with Patricia without doing your own research, every time you stayed quiet when she bullied someone, you gave her more power. She looked down at her coffee, tears forming in her eyes. I know. I've been thinking about that a lot, about all the people in the neighborhood she harassed and how I could have stopped it if I'd just been braver. So be braver next time. We don't have an HOA anymore, but there will be other situations where someone tries to take control or push people around. Stand up earlier, ask questions, do your own research. I will, I promise. She finished her coffee and stood up. For what it's worth, I'm glad you fought back. I'm glad someone finally stopped her. After Susan left, I thought about her words. It was easy to blame Patricia for everything, but she hadn't operated in a vacuum. She had needed enablers, people who went along with her schemes out of fear or apathy or misguided loyalty. The HOA had become tyrannical not just because of one bad leader, but because good people had stayed silent. The check from the county arrived 2 weeks later, as promised. $7,213, representing the final settlement of Patricia's debt to me. Combined with the auction proceeds, I'd recovered my storage fees, and then some. I deposited the check and then did something I had been planning. I used part of the money to throw a neighborhood barbecue. I sent invitations to every house in the former Meadowbrook Estates HOA, inviting everyone to a Freedom from HOA party at my property on the last Saturday in August. About 40 people showed up, nearly half the neighborhood. I rented a professional barbecue setup, bought enough burgers and hot dogs to feed an army, and set up lawn games for the kids. George brought his sound system and played music. The Johnsons brought their basketball hoop that Patricia had called unsightly and set it up for the kids to play. The Patel family brought dishes from their vegetable garden that Patricia had wanted removed, and they were delicious. Mrs. Henderson, the 92-year-old who had been cited for grass height violations, arrived in a wheelchair pushed by her grandson. She was sharp as a tack and had everyone laughing with stories about the neighborhood from 40 years ago, long before the HOA existed. "We all just helped each other back then," she said, her voice clear despite her age. "If someone's roof needed repair, the men in the neighborhood would help. If someone was sick, the women would bring meals. We didn't need a board or a president or bylaws. We just needed to be good neighbors." "That's what we're trying to get back to," George said, "being neighbors instead of HOA members." "Well, it's about time," Mrs. Henderson declared. "That Patricia woman sent me a fine for my grass being too long while I was in the hospital recovering from surgery. My grandson was doing his best to keep up with my yard while visiting me every day, and she threatened to put a lien on my house." The anger that rippled through the crowd at that story was palpable. I hadn't known about that particular incident, and clearly neither had most of the neighbors. "She's gone now," I said firmly, "and she's not coming back. This neighborhood is ours again." The party lasted until after dark. Kids ran around catching fireflies while adults talked and laughed. People exchanged phone numbers and made plans to help each other with various projects. The Johnson family was renovating their basement and needed advice on electrical work. The neighbor, who was a licensed electrician, offered to help. The Martinez family was planning a garden and needed landscaping ideas. The Patel family offered to share their expertise and even some starter plants. As I cleaned up after everyone left, with George staying to help, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: genuine community. Not forced community mandated by bylaws and enforced with fines, but real connection between people who chose to look out for each other. "This was good," George said, folding up a table. "People needed this. They needed to remember that they're not subjects of an HOA. They're homeowners who happen to live near each other." "You know, Patricia called me last week," George said casually. I stopped what I was doing. "What did she want?" "She wanted me to tell her who filed the restraining order. I told her I couldn't disclose that. Then she wanted to know if there was any way to appeal the HOA dissolution. I told her 78% of residents voted for it, so no, there was no appeal." "How did she sound?" "Angry. Bitter. She kept insisting that she had been right, that the HOA needed strong leadership, that people were too stupid to manage their own properties. She blamed you for everything, said you had poisoned the neighborhood against her." I shook my head. "I didn't poison anyone. I just refused to let her use my property without permission." That's what I told her. I also told her that if she had just apologized after the first incident, if she had removed the furniture and offered to pay reasonable storage fees, all of this could have been avoided. She hung up on me. We finished cleaning in silence. The night air was cool now, a hint of the fall that would come in a few weeks. My barn stood dark and empty of everything except my projects. My property was mine again, fully and completely. The final piece of the story came in October. I received a formal letter from the Ohio Attorney General's office. They had investigated Patricia's misuse of HOA funds based on the insurance company's report and found evidence of embezzlement and fraud. Patricia was being charged with theft and abuse of fiduciary duty. If convicted, she could face up to 5 years in prison and would have to pay restitution to all the homeowners she had stolen from. The trial was scheduled for January. I was listed as a potential witness, though the prosecutor told me they likely wouldn't need my testimony since the financial records spoke for themselves. Patricia had been sloppy in her theft, claiming obviously personal expenses as HOA business, spa treatments as stress management for HOA duties, designer clothes as professional attire for board meetings, even a vacation to Cancun as a HOA leadership conference. In December, Patricia took a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to reduced charges and was sentenced to 2 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 1 year. She was also ordered to pay full restitution, which amounted to over $30,000 when all her fraudulent expenses were totaled. I didn't attend the sentencing. I had moved on. The Honda CB750 was nearly complete, and I was already planning my next project, a 1965 Harley-Davidson that I had found in a barn in Kentucky. My weekends were spent working in my barn, riding my restored motorcycles, and helping neighbors with various projects. The neighborhood had transformed. Without the HOA fees, people had more money to invest in their properties. Without the threat of fines and violations, people took pride in their homes without fear. The entrance landscaping, now managed by a simple neighborhood committee, looked better than ever because the landscapers were accountable directly to the residents rather than to an HOA board. In February, a year after the moving truck had first shown up at my barn, I took both motorcycles out for a long ride. The Triumph and the Honda riding together for the first time, roaring down country roads under a clear blue sky. I felt free in a way I hadn't felt in years. When I got back, there was a note on my door from the Johnson family. Their daughter was doing a school project on community heroes and wanted to interview me about standing up to the HOA. I smiled. I wasn't a hero. I was just a guy who didn't want someone else's furniture in his barn. But maybe that was enough. Maybe standing up for your rights, following the law, and refusing to be bullied was heroic in its own small way. Not because it was dramatic or exciting, but because it reminded other people that they had power too, that they didn't have to accept unreasonable demands or illegal actions just because someone had a title like HOA president. I called the Johnson family and agreed to the interview. Their daughter Emma came over the next Saturday with a notebook full of questions. She was 12 years old, bright-eyed, and curious. "My mom says you beat the HOA in court," she said, pen poised over her notebook. "I didn't beat anyone. I just enforced my property rights when someone tried to use my barn without permission." "But you auctioned all their furniture. That's so cool," I laughed. "It wasn't about being cool. It was about following the law. When someone leaves property on your land without permission and refuses to remove it, Ohio law gives you certain rights. I used those rights." "Were you scared?" That was a good question. I thought about it carefully. Yes, I was scared that I might lose, that I might end up paying thousands in legal fees, that the HOA might make my life miserable. But I was more scared of what would happen if I didn't stand up for myself. Because if they got away with using my barn, what would they do next? Emma wrote furiously in her notebook. "My mom says Mrs. Whitmore was mean. Mrs. Whitmore made bad choices. She thought being HOA president gave her more power than it did. She thought she could ignore property rights in the law. She was wrong. She went to jail. She went to jail because she stole money and broke the law, not because she was mean, but because she committed crimes." Emma nodded seriously. "My teacher says that laws protect everyone, but only if people follow them." Your teacher is right, and when people don't follow the laws, there are consequences. That's how society works. The interview lasted about an hour. Emma asked thoughtful questions about property rights, HOA regulations, and why adults sometimes make bad decisions. I answered as honestly as I could, trying to give her a nuanced understanding rather than a simple good versus evil story. After she left, I realized that this was the real lesson of the whole experience. It wasn't about me winning or Patricia losing. It was about the importance of knowing your rights, standing up for them respectfully but firmly, and letting the legal system work the way it was designed to work. Patricia could have won. If she had followed proper procedures, if she had asked permission and negotiated fairly, if she had treated my property with respect, I would have probably let the HOA use my barn for a reasonable fee. But she had been so convinced of her own authority, so certain that the HOA gave her power over other people's property, that she had destroyed herself. Spring came to Ohio with its usual mix of rain and sunshine. The Harley restoration was going well, though it was a bigger project than I had anticipated. My barn smelled of oil and metal and possibility. On weekends, neighbors would stop by to see how the work was going, to offer advice or just to chat. The neighborhood had evolved into something organic and real. People helped each other because they wanted to, not because a board mandated it. Properties were well maintained because owners took pride in them, not because they feared fines. Disputes were resolved with conversations over coffee, not threats of liens and legal action. In May, I got a letter from Patricia. It was forwarded from the county jail where she was serving her sentence. I almost threw it away without reading it, but curiosity got the better of me. The letter was 2 pages, handwritten in careful script. She didn't apologize, exactly, but she acknowledged that she had made mistakes in judgment. She blamed the stress of being HOA president, the pressure to maintain property values, and the difficulty of managing uncooperative residents. She said she hoped I was satisfied with the outcome and that I understood she had only been trying to do what was best for the community. I read the letter twice, looking for any hint of genuine understanding or remorse. I didn't find it. Patricia still believed she had been right, that her intentions justified her actions, that the ends justified the means. She had learned nothing. I didn't write back. There was nothing to say. Patricia's story was over, at least as far as I was concerned. She would serve her time, pay her restitution, and hopefully find a new direction in life. But she would do it without any input from me. Instead, I focused on the Harley. It was a beautiful machine, even in pieces, all raw potential waiting to be realized. I worked on it methodically, carefully, enjoying the process as much as the goal. There was something meditative about restoration work, about taking something broken and making it whole again. By July, the Harley was done. It was a beast of a motorcycle, all chrome and power and rumbling exhaust. I took it out on a Sunday morning, riding through the countryside with the sun on my back and the wind in my face. I thought about everything that had happened, all the stress and conflict and ultimate resolution. Was it worth it? The months of tension, the legal fees, the conflict with neighbors, the anger and frustration? Yes, absolutely yes. Because the alternative was surrender, was accepting that someone else could use my property without permission, could violate my rights without consequences. The alternative was teaching my neighborhood that bullies win if you just let them. I rode past the entrance to Meadowbrook Estates, past the landscaping that the neighborhood committee now maintained, past houses where people lived without fear of arbitrary fines or made-up violations. The old HOA sign was gone, replaced with a simple marker showing the neighborhood name without any mention of an association. When I got home, George was waiting in my driveway with his wife, Martha. They had news. "We're moving," George said, but he was smiling. "Martha got a promotion. We're relocating to Denver." I was happy for them, but sad for myself. George had been a true friend through the whole HOA ordeal, the one board member who had stood up to Patricia from the beginning. "I'm going to miss having you as a neighbor," I said honestly. "We'll miss this place too. But we wanted to tell you something before we go." George glanced at Martha, who nodded encouragingly. "We're selling our house to a young couple with 2 kids. They asked about the neighborhood, about whether there was an HOA. When I told them the story, about Patricia and the furniture, and how you stood up for your rights, they said that's exactly the kind of neighborhood they wanted to live in. A place where people respect each other's property and rights." Martha added, "They said they were tired of looking at houses in HOA neighborhoods where every little thing was regulated. They wanted freedom to paint their house the color they wanted, to have a vegetable garden if they wanted, to let their kids play basketball in the driveway without someone complaining. That's what this neighborhood is now," I said, "what it should have always been." George and Martha moved in August. Their house sold quickly, and the new family, the Andersons, moved in with enthusiasm and energy. Their kids were out playing in the yard constantly, and their basketball hoop went up in the driveway on the first day. It made me smile every time I saw it. Fall came, then winter. I started a new project, a 1948 Indian chief that I found in a barn in West Virginia. It was in rough shape, but I could see the potential. I had time, tools, and a barn that was entirely my own to work in. The neighborhood thrived. Without HOA fees, several families invested in solar panels. The Patel family expanded their vegetable garden and started sharing produce with neighbors. The Martinez family painted their house a cheerful yellow that Patricia would have had a stroke over, and it looked great. In December, I got a Christmas card from Emma Johnson. Inside was a photo of her school project presentation, a poster board with pictures of me, the barn, and the motorcycles. The title read, "How My Neighbor Stood Up for Property Rights." She had gotten an A. I put the card on my refrigerator, where it stayed all winter. The following spring, 2 years after the furniture incident, I got a call from a reporter from Columbus Monthly magazine. They were doing a story on HOA overreach, and someone had recommended they talk to me. I agreed to an interview, figuring that maybe my experience could help other people dealing with similar situations. The article came out in April. It was titled, "How One Homeowner Fought HOA Overreach and Won." It detailed the furniture incident, the legal battle, and Patricia's eventual criminal charges. But it also included interviews with other residents, with the lawyer who had investigated the HOA's finances, and with a law professor from Ohio State who talked about the importance of property rights and the legal limitations on HOA authority. The article went viral, at least by local standards. I got emails from homeowners across Ohio and even from other states, people dealing with tyrannical HOAs, asking for advice. I responded to as many as I could, always with the same basic message. Know your rights, document everything, follow legal procedures, and don't be afraid to stand up for yourself. Some people took my advice. I heard back from a few who successfully fought HOA overreach in their own neighborhoods. Others thanked me, but said they were moving instead, that fighting wasn't worth it to them. I respected that choice too. Not every battle is worth fighting, and not everyone has the resources or temperament for legal conflict. For me, though, it had been worth it. My property was mine. My barn was mine. My motorcycles gleamed in their spaces, and the Indian Chief Restoration was coming along beautifully. I had a neighborhood full of friends rather than suspicious HOA members. I had peace. On a warm evening in May, exactly 2 years after the auction, I hosted another neighborhood barbecue. It had become an annual tradition, a celebration of community without compulsion. Nearly 60 people showed up this time, including some new families who had moved in specifically because the neighborhood didn't have an HOA. As the sun set and people gathered around the fire pit I had built, someone asked me to tell the story of the furniture one more time. I hesitated, not wanting to dwell on old conflicts, but the kids who hadn't heard it begged, and the new neighbors wanted to know. So I told it. Not as a triumphant story of victory, but as a lesson in standing up for yourself, following the law, and refusing to be bullied. I emphasized the legal steps I had taken, the documentation that had saved me, the importance of knowing your rights and exercising them properly. When I finished, the group was quiet for a moment. Then Mrs. Henderson, now 94 and still sharp, raised her glass of lemonade. "To Walter," she said in her clear voice, "for reminding us all that our homes are our castles and no one has the right to enter without permission." Everyone raised their drinks. To Walter, I felt my face flush with embarrassment, but also with pride. Not pride in defeating Patricia or the HOA, but pride in doing the right thing the right way, in standing up without escalating to violence or revenge, in using the legal system as it was designed to be used, in setting an example that had helped create a better community. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and I was cleaning up, I stood in my barn doorway looking out at my property. 15 acres of freedom. A barn full of projects. Motorcycles that ran perfectly because I had restored them with my own hands. Neighbors who respected each other because they chose to, not because they were forced to. This was what I had bought the property for. This was what I had fought for. And it was worth every moment of stress, every dollar of legal fees, every hour of documentation and preparation. The furniture incident had been 2 years ago, but its effects would last forever. Not just for me, but for my entire neighborhood. We had learned that we didn't need an HOA to have a good community. We just needed to be good people, to respect each other's property and rights, to help when asked, but not intrude when not wanted. As I locked up the barn and walked back to my house, I thought about Patricia in jail, about Dale on probation, about Susan learning to be braver. I didn't wish them ill. I hoped they learned from their mistakes. I hoped they understood now that power without legitimacy is tyranny, and tyranny always falls eventually. But mostly, I just felt grateful. Grateful for my property, my projects, my neighbors, and my freedom. Grateful that I lived in a country where property rights meant something, where laws protected individuals from overreach, where even a homeowner with a barn could stand up to an HOA and win if he was right. I went inside, poured myself a beer, and sat on my back porch watching the stars come out. Tomorrow I would work on the Indian Chief. Next weekend I would ride the Triumph. Next month I would help the Anderson family build a treehouse for their kids. These were the things that mattered: work, hobbies, helping neighbors, living in peace. The HOA was gone. Patricia was gone. The furniture was long gone, sold at auction 2 years ago. But I was still here, on my property, in my home, living my life on my own terms. And that, in the end, was all I had ever wanted.